everyone, it's Stacey. Thank you so much for joining me today on my channel. In this video, we'll be finishing off our quilted wall hanging. And if you'd like the supplies list, you can find that in the description below. It would be amazing if you'd subscribe to my channel if you do like this YouTube video, and make sure you hit the little bell button so you'll get notifications every time I do a new video. But for now, let's finish our quilted wall hanging. So the first thing we're going to do is baste our quilt top so that we can quilt it. So I'll just pop that aside, and I've got a piece of backing fabric here and I've given it a quick press, and it's a little bit bigger than my quilt top. Then I've got a bit of batting that I'm going to put down, making sure it's all nice and smooth. And this again is bigger than my quilt top, so I'll just smooth that out. Then I'll take my little quilt top, because essentially what we are doing is making a little mini quilt. And then I'm just going to smooth that out. So we want all three layers nice and smooth. And I plan to pin mine with some basting pins. You could also use basting spray. And I'm going to pin mine bearing in mind where I plan to quilt. So I'm going to quilt along all the seams, which is called echoing. So when I pin them, I'm just going to make sure they're not getting in the way of where I plan to sew. You can quilt yours however you like, but just bear that in mind when you're placing your pins in. So now I've finished my pinning. If this was a big quilt, we would have started in the middle and worked our way out. We would have also taped down the backing and the batting, but because it's so little, we don't have to be that particular. So now I'm going to quilt mine. I have put my walking foot on, but because it's so small, you really could just use a standard foot. It does just help with the layers, so I figured I've got a walking foot, I might as well put it on. I'm going to stitch at stitch length 2.5, and I'm going to echo my seams, which means I'm going to come down this side of my seam and then this side of my seam on every single seam, and I'll be doing the same horizontally. But you could quilt yours however you like. Now that I've finished quilting, I've taken out all my basting pins and I did give it a quick press, and now what we're going to do is square it off. So that means we're going to cut off all the excess and make sure that it's sitting nice and square. So we'll make sure that my backing is all smoothed out, and then I'm just simply going to come along and trim all the edges. So what I'll do is I'll just find a line to line up my ruler with. Generally the line you sewed is a good one to go with. I'm doing the best I can to line it up with my seam here, and I can see that that's lined up pretty well to my edge, so I'm just going to trim that off. And I'll do that for all four sides. So now I've cut three 2.5 inch strips from my width of fabric. Now I'm going to use these to make my binding and also to make the loops that we'll be putting the wooden dowel through to hang our hanging. What I'll do is I'll just pop 2 of those strips aside. Then what I did was I took one of the strips and I cut 2 pieces at approximately 15 inches long. Now I'm going to place the right sides together, and I'm going to sew down either side with a 1/4 inch foot. And you can pin if you'd like. If you're a beginner, I do recommend pinning, but today I'm not going to worry about it. Then I'm just going to come down the other side and stitch down that side too. Okay, so then I'll just cut those loose threads. Then we're going to turn it right sides out, so I'm just going to take a pin, pin it onto one side, close it, push it down through, feeding it down. Then I'll just slowly peel it back at the top here, and then I'll push the pin down until I'm at the bottom, and then I'll slowly push that gathered bit back from the top, pushing it all off. And now I'll just give it a quick press. So now we're just going to roll out these seams, finger press them and press. And we'll do that on both sides. Just be careful not to iron the other side. We'll just stay on this side first, then we'll do the other side. Then we'll give the whole thing a press. So now we just want to cut it. So we've got 3 4-inch pieces. So I'll just square off the end here so we've got a nice straight cut to start with. And I'll just flip that around, line it up on 0, line an edge up on the line, and then I'll line up the edge on my ruler and cut it at 4, 8, and 12. Discard that piece and I'll just set those aside for now. So now I'm just going to join my 2.5 inch strips on the diagonal for my binding, and depending on how wide your fabric is, you might need to use that other little bit that you'd have left over from the third piece that we cut to make our loops. So I'm going to face my fabric with the right side facing me. This is a directional fabric and it's also sitting in the correct direction. I can see my little bauble there is with my loop. Then I'm going to take my second piece and I want to have it right sides down, but I want the fabric facing to the right. So if I was to sew that now, it would actually be upside down. So I'm just going to turn that around. So I'm going to place it right side down and I can just pretend I've got a diagonal there and lift it up and check it. So now I can see that sitting correctly. So what we'll do is we'll line up this on a line, this bottom strip on a line, the top strip on a line coming down, and then we just draw a line from where they meet in the corner down to the bottom where they meet. Then I'll just take a pin and pin those in place, and then I'll sew. So now I'm just going to sew along the line that I drew, and I've got my standard foot on and I don't need to worry about doing a back stitch. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim this off at about 1/4 inch. You can do that with your rotary cutter or with scissors. Cut the little triangles and press it open. So now I'm going to attach my binding. I do have a very comprehensive video on how to do it, which is foolproof, and I'll have the link above and down in the description if you'd like to see that video. I'm going to show you how I do it, which is a slightly quicker method without me measuring my 1/4 inches at the end and start. So what I do is I still fold it in half. I'm going to allow about a 10-inch tail. I have cut that straight, that end there, and that's where I'm starting. And then I'll be working in the middle here when I join the two ends. So I'm going to start about here. Then with the edges lined up on the binding, I'll just clip that. You could use pins. And I'm making sure I'm getting all the layers. Now I'm just going to sew that to about 1/4 inch away from the edge. So now I'm going to sew where I put that first clip in along the edge, and I'm just using my standard foot now. You could use a 1/4 inch foot if you'd like. I'm using this standard foot, sewing at about a 1/4 inch, but it's going to be just slightly generous this time. I am going to be stitching at stitch length 2. I'll stitch forward, I'll do back stitch, and then I'll go forward. So I'm lining up the edge of my foot to the edge of my quilt here, knowing that that's approximately a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then I'm going to sew down and guess about 1/4 inch away from my edge. Then I'll do a back stitch. Just going to trim those threads while I'm here. Then I'm going to take my binding, making sure those edges are lined up. I'm going to fold it over to the right. Then I'm going to bring it down and line it up with the edges. Then I'm going to just turn it around so I can see what I'm doing. I'm going to pop a clip in there, and I've got a nice straight line there where the fold is, so I can see that it's sitting really nicely. And then I'm just going to pin all the way down, clip rather, making sure I'm catching all the layers. And then you can just make sure that's sitting nice and flat and you've caught all the layers. Then I'm going to start stitching about 1/4 of an inch down from the edge of my quilt here. And I'm just doing my best guess. I'll start stitching. I will do a back stitch. And then I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom and stop again at 1/4 of an inch. And now I'm coming down to the edge and I'm going to stop at what I think is about 1/4 of an inch, back stitch, and then cut my threads. And I'll do that until I come to the edge where I started. Now it was a little bit tricky because of all the layers, so you could use your walking foot if you'd like to. Now I'm back where I started, and what I did on this last corner was I did exactly the same thing, and I just sewed along a little bit, leaving a nice big opening for us to work in. Now what I'm going to do is take this tail, fold it nicely, lining up those edges, and then I'm going to take this side that's left over, and we need to measure 2.5 inches from where the tail ends down. So I'll make sure it's all nicely smoothed out. Then I'll take my ruler, put the edge on 0 and measure 2.5 inches because that's how wide our binding is. And I'm just going to mark 2.5 inches. And then I'm just going to cut that, make sure it's sitting nice and flat. And then I'm just going to cut that with my scissors. Then what we need to do is join these on the diagonal. So what I'm going to do is take this top piece and bring it down with the right side facing me. And I will fold this over so I've got a bit of room to move. Then this piece, I'm going to open it up and have the right side of the fabric facing down. So I've got this one, just like when we made the diagonal join, this one's going to be coming down straight and this one's going across straight. And I want to just have it slightly overlapping just by a few threads so that it's nice and taut when we sew it. When we're happy with that, we take our ruler and we draw a line again from where the two edges meet. Then I'll just pop a pin in on either side, holding it in place. And what we can do is we can just gently open it up just to check that it is going to work and be a nice continuous line when we're going to sew. And that's looking good to me. It doesn't fit because my pins are pulling it out of shape, but that looks good. So now I'm just going to sew along that line with my standard foot. Before I cut off this excess, I am just going to lay it flat and make sure that it's going to sit really nicely. And as you can see, that now just looks like a continuous piece of binding, so I'm really happy with that. What I'll do now is I'll cut this excess off at 1/4 of an inch and I will press the seams open. So now I'm just going to sew along this edge to finish it off, and if you'd like you could use a couple of clips just to make sure we are having those edges nicely lined up and we're catching all the layers. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give it a press and just press the binding back so it will sit nicely when we're folding it over. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to avoid the corners, but what I will do is finger press the binding over and give it a gentle press, just so it's sitting the way I want it to go when I fold it over. And I'll do that to all 4 sides. So before we finish our binding, we just need to attach our 3 loops that will hold our wooden dowel. So what I'll do is I'll flip that over, and I'm just going to measure 1/2 inch from the edge. I'll take one of my pieces that we made earlier and I'll fold it in half. You could just check that you're happy with how that's going to look when it is attached. So what we'll be doing is we'll be attaching it like this, and then it will be folded up. So you could just quickly check that you're happy with how you'll see the top of the loop. And I quite like that, so I'll go with that. So I've folded it in half, all the edges are lined up. I'm going to line it up with the edges of my quilt, and I'm going to measure 1/2 inch away from the edge. So I just need to move that over a bit. When I'm happy, I'll clip it. And then I'll do the same on this side. Take another one, fold it in half. I might fold it in half the other way this time so they don't look exactly the same. Line up all the edges. Measure 1/2 inch, that looks about right, and then clip it in place. Then we need to do the middle one. So I'm going to fold them in half again, and then I'm actually just going to be able to cheat a little bit here because I can see where my quilting is. So I'm in the middle of my quilting. That looks about right to me. I'm just going to eyeball it, line up all those edges and clip it. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to carefully stitch them into place, making sure I don't go past where I stitched previously. So I'll just take that first clip out so I can see what I'm doing. I'll do a back stitch just so they're nice and secure. Those threads, cut any loose threads. I'm always cutting all those loose threads whenever I get a chance. And when you do that, just make sure the binding is sitting down. We don't want to accidentally catch our binding when we're attaching those. So I've done the first one, now I'll do the other 2. So now we're just going to finish off our binding by folding it over, pinning it, and then stitching in the ditch, which will catch the back and finish off our binding. But first we just need to do a little bit of work on our corners. So what I like to do is just cut off a little bit of the excess of the corner, not a lot because we don't want to lose the structure of the corner, but just enough so it's not so bulky. So just a really tiny bit off that corner. Then I'm going to fold this side over first, folding it right over so I'm covering up my stitches. Then I'll take this side and fold that over. And it's a little bit fiddly, but that's how we get that nice mitered corner there. And then what you can do is just check the back, and you can push down that inside flap so that you're getting a nice mitered corner on the back too. And once you're happy with it, then you can pin it ready for sewing. Just making sure you are catching all those layers when you pin it into place, because that's the best way of knowing you're going to catch them when you sew them on your sewing machine. So I'm going to now go around and do all my corners and my edges, and then I'm going to stitch in the ditch, catching that back. If you wanted to, you could hand stitch the back now, which is a tidier finish, but I'm always in a bit of a rush to finish my projects. So now I'm just going to stitch in the ditch really carefully, and like I said, you could always just do this by hand. So now we're going to finish it off. I've got a piece of dowel here, and I've used one that's 3/4 of an inch thick, and then I cut it to 20.5 inches with a little saw and then sanded it down. If you don't have access to a saw, you could use one that's thinner and then just cut it with a serrated knife. Then what we do is we just thread it through our loops, which I have ironed, by the way, to help them sit up like this. I gave the whole Quilted Wall Hanging an iron. I know some of you will tease me because ironing is one of my favorite things, but it always helps to make things sit nicer. Then when we've got our wooden dowel and our loops, take a piece of string. This is about 30 inches long, but I will trim it. I'm just going to simply tie it on one end. Then bring it up and over and tie it on the other, and then how long you have that is really up to you and what space you're hanging it in. But then I'll just tie it here, and then if you'd like you can trim those to whatever length you'd want, and then we've finished our wall hanging. Okay everyone, so now we've finished our quilted wall hanging. Now if you don't want to do the binding, I know a lot of people aren't a fan of binding, you could always do my self-binding technique, and then you just attach the loops onto the back in the little stitch in the ditch here, and you can find instructions on that on the link above, and I'll also put them in the description. Thank you so much for joining me, and next week we'll be making a Christmas tree skirt. Thank you for watching my videos. If you're enjoying them, please like, subscribe and leave a comment.